Well, we're back working on this Malibu with a network problem. Ever since I disconnected the battery the other day to check the terminating resistance, it's been fine. But after talking with the customer a few minutes ago, he said sometimes it will go 2 to 2.5 weeks before it acts up. So I'm going to use the Tech 2 here to scan this thing. Like this factory tool does an auto ID. Can you believe that? Oh, I gotta get the VIN. So they don't give you the VIN number, it tell you this one is a code Z. So I'm gonna go into vehicle control systems. And this is the 2.2. Doesn't have OnStar. Vehicle DTC. So this should do a network scan now. So body control module is present, no codes. Digital radio receiver doesn't have a digital radio receiver. BCM doesn't have. HVAC control it doesn't have. That's automatic AC. Instrument panel it will have. And you can see what pins at the DLC it's using. Pin 1, PCM, DLC pin 2. So it communicates with the PCM over pin 2, not 6 and 14. That could explain why I still had communication with the PCM even though the BCM was not communicating. Theft deterrent module. So now you see how this scan tool prioritizes the modules that didn't talk. So digital radio receiver, EBCM, HVAC control module. Well, it doesn't have the electronic, EBCM is electronic brake control module. It doesn't have anti-lock brakes, believe it or not. And it has manual AC, so it doesn't have automatic climate control. But it's nice to know which module. Let's go down the list here. See, that'd be 6 and 14. Pin 1. So that used a dedicated connection on connector on DLC pin 2. There's a wire that goes from the DLC pin 2 directly to the PCM. That could allow the scan tool to communicate with the PCM even though the CAN bus could be down. Because the other day when the fuel gauge was at 0 or at empty and the check engine light was on and security light was on and the service power steering system was up there. Interesting. I'm going to try and confirm that it's actually communicating on pin 2. Okay, so I'm going to restart this scan, and this time I've got a breakout box. This is pin 1 showing activity on pin 1. This is pin 2, and I never saw any activity on there. But I'm going to restart the scan, and I'm going to show you that when we're communicating with the BCM, radio receiver, no comm, EBCM, no comm, HVAC control will be no comm, instrument panel cluster, that's DLC pin 1. Now the PCM is going to be scanned right now. See the activity on that pin 2? So it actually does talk to the PCM on pin 2. That explains why, or potentially explains why I had communication with the PCM even though it's at the very end of the CAN bus when the BCM and the rest of the modules on the CAN bus are down. So that apparently is the BCM serial number. 144157. Let's have a look and see if that matches the car. Now as you can see, it doesn't match the car. So that is a used BCM in there, and they couldn't change the VIN number, but they managed to configure it to the point where it would actually work. So I got the Snap-on Veris Edge connected to the PCM viewing data, and you can see the activity on pin 2. So it does use that pin 2 wire dedicated to communication with the PCM. It doesn't use the high-speed CAN bus, although there's CAN activity, of course. I guess the only way to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt would be to disconnect the CAN bus from the ECM and see if we still have communication and data. And apparently it just uses that pin 2 wire on the 2.2 liter engine only, according to the schematics. Now, the customer said to me that he's been fighting with this problem for about 3 years now. The BCM was replaced 3 years ago, and it was good for a couple of weeks and then started acting up again. So I kind of doubt that the BCM is the problem, but where the problem lies is going to be a challenge, I'll tell you. So I'm doing some research here, and I'm looking for the transmission control computer, and this is where it shows it. Basically, the engine control ECM is underneath in front of the battery, and it shows it on the frame rail. It's not there, unless this is not a 4T45E. Oh my goodness sakes. And this is for a 4T65E, and it's exactly the same. Shows it on the inside of the frame rail on the left-hand side of the car. Thought I'd look in a different information system, and it shows it pretty vague, but underneath the front of the car. It's not there. There's a wiring harness from the actual ECM. No, it's not there. So a good reason why I can't find the transmission computer, because it doesn't have one. It only has a transmission computer if it has RPO code M15. And I have MN5 and MX0. So that eliminates another computer we don't have. We don't have this. So that really narrows it down to either the ECM, the power steering control module, or the BCM. I like this. We're eliminating computers because we don't have the vehicle OnStar. We don't have anti-lock brakes. We don't have the transmission controller. The functions are handled by the ECM, PCM. Oh my goodness sakes. I unplugged the transmission computer, or unplugged the transmission connector, and the vehicle still starts and runs, and that wouldn't be possible if it actually had this in the computer or in the transmission. So I don't know exactly what to do at this point. I'm going to take the connections apart at the computer and make sure that there's no signs of corrosion. It's in connector 1. Connector 1 is the 56 terminal BU, I guess that's blue. Connector 2 is 73, and connector 3 is 73. Oh wait, we got to look at what engine code we have, for crying out loud. LX9, L81, LZ9. I'm going to get a picture of the RPO code list. So here's the RPO code list off this. You better make sure the VIN number matches the one on the car in case somebody changed the glove box. And JKL. This is L61. So let's see what that pertains to. So the CAN bus is in connector 1, which is blue. I would assume that connector 1 is one of the connectors on the side. This one's blue. That would make sense. Let's have a look at that. So I unplugged that connector at the PCM, and there it is there. It looks pristine inside, but I accidentally unplugged it with the key on. And the interesting thing is the instrument cluster odometer read error, the fuel gauge went to empty, and the headlights came on, and I'm sure I generated a whole bunch of communication fault codes by unplugging it. And realistically, that's at the end of the network, so there's a twisted pair of wires here, these two wires here that come in. Those are the CAN bus wires, and I got to figure out which two terminals there are. I've got the battery disconnected, so I'm going to measure the resistance going back the other way from these two pins, and that is pin 1 and 2. Pin 1 and 2. So that's measuring the CAN bus from this connector, which is this pins 1 and 2, back through the BCM, because there's a 120 ohm resistor in the BCM. The spec according to GM said 60 plus or minus 10, where I've usually understood it to be 60 plus or minus 2. And remember, it, if you watch the other video, it was 65 measured at the DLC. So I'm going to lab scope the network here with this connector unplugged and see what kind of interesting issues we get. So there's the CAN bus activity lab scoped right at the PCM connector. And CAN H is pin 1. It's not labeled here. Yeah, it doesn't say which one it is. I wonder if that class 2 data, no, it comes in on pin 15. C115, same connector, 15. Well, let's scan it and see what kind of codes it's generating. I can't turn the headlights off. That's interesting. See, the fuel gauge is reading empty and the odometer is reading error. I thought the odometer reading was stored in the BCM. Why would it be reading error? Because we lost the ECM. See, this is another thing that's misleading too. When you see two selections in the scan tool, engine and transmission, it kind of leads you to believe there's two separate modules. And then when you see two separate modules in the schematic, you assume that there are two separate computers, but engine and transmission are one and the same. So I'm going to do a code scan now with the ECM unplugged. I guess we can do a pre-scan. Key on. Interesting, the headlights are malfunctioning because of it. Lost communication with the powertrain control module. And you notice we got no communication with the transmission computer and the engine computer. Lost communication with the powertrain control module. CAN bus communication. Lost communication with the body control module. So why would the power steering module lose communication with the BCM because of an open in the network at the end of the network? Wow, that's weird. So this problem could be caused by a problem with the ECM or the wiring to it. Well, I'm going to put some electrical enhancing liquid on those terminals. Put some dielectric grease around the connector and seal it. And maybe open the harness a bit and see if I can see any compromised wires. So I'm going to clear all the codes now. Clear all codes read by code scan. Instrument cluster. Radio, theft deterrent. So I don't see the ECM. Maybe there were no codes in the ECM. Why would there be? It was disconnected. Oh, I didn't want to do that. wanted to do another code scan. The speedometer, or the fuel gauge, and the odometer are reading correctly now. Well, I put some of this electrical stability 22A on the CAN bus wires at the PCM, retaped the harness, opened the loom up a bit, couldn't see any compromised wires. The wiring harness looks normal. I think I'm going to drive this tomorrow and see if it acts up. So just came back from my other job. Total of about 75 kilometers round trip. 2 drive cycles, once in the morning, once this afternoon. No messages, no problem with the fuel gauge, no problem with the odometer reading, the Prendl indicator. So this network problem seems to have fixed itself, or did I fix it by cycling the connections at the ECM and the BCM? Well, we'll drive it again tomorrow. So I've decided to take a look closer at the power steering control module connector that contains the CAN bus wires. So it's an 8-pin connector. It's at the base of the steering column towards the left hand side of the column, and pins 1 and 2 are the CAN in, and 5 and 6 are CAN out. So let's have a look under the dash where that lives. So we'll have a look down here. Well, this is hard to get in here. All right, so let's zoom out a bit. Okay, so this connector here with the tan wires to it and the one pink wire is the CAN bus. So with the vehicle running, I'm going to manipulate this connector, and then I'm going to experiment by unplugging the connector and interrupting communication, because it goes in and out of this module on the way to the ECM. And I'm going to answer the phone. So I manipulated that connector while it's running, and no change in fuel gauge or the odometer reading. So I'm going to purposely unplug that connector and see what code sets and what modules I can talk to. I should theoretically be able to still talk to the BCM with the scan tool, because the BCM is in between the the network is wired such that it goes from the DLC to the BCM, through the BCM to the power steering control module, from the power steering control module to the PCM, the powertrain control module. And if I unplug the powertrain control module, I still have communication with the BCM and power steering control. So we'll see what goes on. So you can see with that connector unplugged, as soon as I unplugged it, there was a dinging sound from the radio. At least I assume it's from the radio. The speedometer reads error, or the odometer reads error, the Prendl is out, and the fuel gauge is at empty. Low fuel message, and power steering assist doesn't work, which is exactly what he says happens. Now let's see what modules I can communicate with. So we got it set up and connected to the vehicle. We'll just do a network code scan here as soon as it IDs the vehicle. And let's do a code scan. Now, as I said, we should still be able to talk to the EC or PCM, because it has a dedicated wire from the DLC and pin 2 to the PCM. So you see, we still got communication with the ECM, but we have lost communication with the body control. The transmission computer is the PCM. We still have body control module communication, and lost communication with the powertrain, makes sense, and lost communication with the steering wheel control. And of course, it doesn't have anti-lock brakes, it doesn't have OnStar. So let's go back now and just try to make sure that we have data from the BCM. So if you recall from the first video, when it was acting up, I had no communication with the BCM and the power steering control module. Just like, well, U2109, lost communication. And let's make sure we got data. Chassis data. Now that connector looks clean. In fact, there's a little bit of dielectric grease on it. Yeah, we've got data from the body control module. So I'm going to put some electrical stability enhancement, this Stabilitin 22A, come on, focus, on the electrical terminals at the power steering control module on the CAN bus wires, and reconnect it and clear the codes. Okay, I've got it reconnected. I blew the connector out with deoxit and then put some of that Stabilitin 22A in there. Let's do a post scan now and see. There shouldn't be any codes in the power steering control module. Because it was offline completely, so it wouldn't set any codes. And one of the wires in that connector was the power feed wire, the ignition feed wire to it. Okay, let's see what we got. See, no codes in the power steering control module, but it's reporting now. So we're going to clear all these codes. I wonder if we could be losing power on one of the BCM feeds. I wonder if we could duplicate that by removing a BCM fuse or ignition feed fuse to the BCM, because like I said, on the first time this did this, I had no communication with the BCM and the power steering control module, but I did have communication with the PCM. But the PCM has also got its own dedicated wire to pin 2 of the DLC. So let's have a look at the power feeds to the BCM. So the BCM on this car is also a fuse panel, and it's under the console, as you've seen in the first video. There are some fuses in it. Now those fuses got replaced with the other BCM, but I'm looking at, there's 4 diagrams in the Mitchell system that show the BCM. So there's one, here's the second one. Now there are 4 fuses that, 1, 2, 3, 4 fuses. 1, 2, 3 hot at all times fuses, and 1 with hot with run crank relay energized. And these are in the underhood fuse panel. So if one of these fuses was corroded, creating a voltage drop, this is a 50 amp fuse, this is a 30, 30, and a 30. There's quite large fuses. They're the main battery feeds coming into this thing. I wonder what happens if one of those fuses is corroded, oxidized, or has a poor connection. Then obviously we also have to concern ourselves with potential grounds to the BCM. Now here's the 4th diagram. And there's G203, center console front of body control module. So there's a ground under the dash. I wonder if we got a bad body ground, because that would affect everything. I never paid attention, or never even thought to check as to whether or not the interior lights came on, and this thing has power door locks and power windows. I never paid attention as to whether or not they actually worked, and now the car is not acting up. Well, let's have a look at those fuses, these 4 fuses for sure. That's common sense. So the 4 fuses are 25, 21, 19, and 20. And in here, that's those 4 over there, which I have marked with white paint dots. So this one, this one, this one, and this one. They're all J fuses. We're going to pull them out and have a look at them one at a time to make sure that the terminals aren't corroded. Then I'm going to try and experiment. I'm going to leave, say, this fuse out and see how that affects the operation of the BCM. I'm thinking if there's a problem with one of the power feeds to the BCM, it might cause it to shut down and give us our symptom. Remember, we had no communication with the BCM and the power steering control module. Let's see what happens. So the fuses look pristine. I pulled this fuse out, made no difference. I pulled this fuse out by itself and it killed my scanner, so that's obviously feeding the powers for the scan tool. I put that back in, I put this one out, the car starts and runs, no network issues that I can see, and I pulled this one out, same thing. So there's obviously redundancy built into the circuit. It doesn't show any other fuses other than the ones that are actually in the BCM, but these are the 4 fuses that supply power to the BCM. Let's see if pulling any of those fuses generated any fault codes in any controllers. Engine, airbag. We didn't have that code before. We didn't have those codes. So it did generate a lost communication with the steering column control module, because it probably, one of those fuses likely feeds the steering column control. But we never had this U2111 in the past, so I'm going to look at the BCM connector, this one right here, connector 2, which is labeled J2 on the BCM. It's fairly accessible, pins 1, 2, 19 and 20. Let's have a look at that connector view. This takes you to a master component list, and where's body control module? I gotta find a picture of the connector. It was there, I just didn't see it. Body control module, BCM. Let's have a look at these connectors here. See BCM connector 2, see what it looks like. So that's that connector. 1 and 2 and 19 and 20. 1 and 2. So that'll be 1 and 2, and then 19, 20. So the 4 pins on the corner. I'm going to take that apart and have a look at it. So this is connector 2. It's labeled J2 on the BCM. It's a latched connector. I've got the key on, and I'm going to manipulate this connector. Here you see it on the actual BCM. That's it right there. So I'm going to manipulate this connector and see if it creates a problem with the fuel gauge or anything. Not yet. Wiggle the wires. Nothing. Well, let's unplug it. Interesting. The fuel gauge went to empty, but the odometer reading just didn't disappear. Let's see what happens when I turn it off and back on. And of course, with the BCM disconnected, I got no crank, because there's no communication between the BCM and of course I'll have no communication with it because I've got the wires unplugged. You can see there's no network activity on 6 and 14, which is this pin and this pin here. Well, I'm going to blow those terminals out and put some stability 22A on those ones as well. So I cleared all the codes out of it again. And that's as far as we're going to go. I'm going to put the panels back on this thing, and I'm going to drive it again tomorrow and see if it acts up. If it doesn't, I'm going to give it back to the customer and tell him he has to drive it. Talking to the customer yesterday evening, and he said that sometimes it will go 2 weeks before it acts up, and then it'll act up multiple times in the same day. So given the fact that we had no communication with the BCM when it was acting up, and no communication with the power steering control module, I'm leaning towards a BCM, but that would mean 2 failed BCMs. It's certainly possible, I guess. So I've done 8 drive cycles with this thing now. I put several, probably a couple 100 kilometers on it over 8 drive cycles, and no more BCM issues, no more problem with the fuel gauge or odometer reading error or the Prundle display disappearing. Then a network scan and there's no network codes, but we do have a problem with the power door lock, so I'm going to diagnose that.